Everyone, at least everyone who's heard this podcast before, has heard the idea that we need to align AI. That means we want to get AI to align with or have the same morals or values or principles as us. And a standard way of doing this is to try to give AI various kinds of rules, or to try to tell it what kinds of things, very broadly speaking, are acceptable or unacceptable. But my guest today thinks that's the wrong way to approach something like what you might call moral or normative development in AI agents, or AI more generally. My guest is Gillian Hadfield. She is the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of AI Alignment and Governance at Johns Hopkins University. And she thinks that giving AI a bunch of rules to follow misunderstands what it is to be normative, or as she puts it, how normativity works. As she understands it, normativity is about understanding what's permissible or impermissible in a given context or community. But even more specifically than that, she thinks that it's a kind of capacity that we have. We have a normative capacity to enter into a community, look at the various behaviors that are going on, the things that people are saying, the things that institutions are allowing or disallowing, and gleaning from those observations what's permissible and what's impermissible, and further understanding that one gets some kind of punishment, some kind of enforcement is involved if you break the rules, if you sort of do something that's the society classifies as impermissible, or you don't do something that's classified as impermissible, so on and so forth. Now, the idea then is that we should be training AI in the same kind of way, that AI alignment should primarily be a matter of trying to give AI the ability to walk into a community, metaphorically speaking, and figure out what's permissible and impermissible. So it's about giving AI a normative capacity, not a set of normative rules. That's Gillian's view. You're going to hear me push back in a variety of ways throughout this conversation. I think that Gillian and I are probably not exactly on the same page. So a couple of things to look out for in the course of our discussion. One is that you might think that there's a certain story about how we came to have our normative capacity or grasp our moral rules in various contexts. And maybe AI should just have a different story about how that comes to be. Why should we think that we need the same causal origins for AI that we do for our own normative capacity? That's one kind of open question. There's also a question about sociopaths. We don't get into too much detail here, but you might think that there's, on the one side, knowing what's permissible or impermissible on the one hand, and being motivated, caring about what's permissible and impermissible on the other. And so I'm not so sure that we can just understand what it is to be ethical creatures just by reference to our knowledge of what's permissible or impermissible in a given context. That's another sort of point of, I would say, light contention. We didn't get into too many details on that front. Then we start to get to a bit more substantive, at least potential disagreement. So one thing to keep in mind here is that you might have certain ethical views that are not shared by your community. Suppose that you think, or you grew up in a place where gay marriage or being gay is classified as impermissible. And you think, actually, I think that's totally fine. I don't see why they think it's impermissible. How do we account for that kind of ethical judgment, given that the ethical judgment, A, it's a normative judgment, clearly, and B, it's not a matter of predicting how other people in the community would classify gay activity as permissible or impermissible. So I'm not sure how Gillian's approach of normativity, or what it is to have a normative capacity, fully explains that kind of phenomenon. And then lastly, I'm a little bit worried, or more than a little bit worried, frankly, that I'm not sure that Gillian is talking about all the normative capacities we have, or maybe that's the way to put it. It's something like, I think that she's primarily concerned with things like prudential judgments, because it's prudent, it's in our self-interest to look out for what do people classify as permissible or impermissible in my community, and what might I get punished for, and I better make sure not to do that kind of thing. I should comport my behavior accordingly. That strikes me as prudential behavior, but not necessarily ethical judgments that you're making. You're making prudential judgments. So insofar as the goal or the mission of AI alignment is to align it with our ethical goals, I'm not sure that teaching it to be prudent is the way down that path. When I think about a capacity for ethical deliberation, I think about things like being able to see that the person is suffering, seeing that the person is in pain, seeing that that person has a certain set of rights and that we ought not to violate them, that sort of thing. That has nothing to do with me making predictions about how the community is going to react and getting punished and so on and so forth. Okay, That's what the conversation is about. Gillian has lots to say on all of these fronts. I'm just trying to highlight these things as points of, I think, at least potential disagreement between her and I, and thus points for you to think about. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about. And of course, as you've heard me say a million times before, I have a new book out called The Ethical Nightmare Challenge. You can buy it on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, at Target, I think, Walmart, all those places. And if you have any questions, comments, trenchant criticisms about me, the book, etc., EM, that's Ethical Machines, EM at readblackman.com. Okay, let's go talk to Gillian. So Gillian, if I have you right, you think that we're squandering an opportunity, maybe entering a dangerous territory as well, because we're not engaged in AI alignment in the right kind of way. So do I have that right?
Yep, basically.
All right, so then that obviously, if I didn't know how to use the expression begs the question, I would say begs the question, but I do know it, so I won't say it.
You do know, that's right. So, okay, don't use it.
Drives me nuts. No, that's not what begging the question means. Everybody look up beg the question. It's a technical thing. It doesn't just mean raises the question. So it does, though, raise the question.
It does
raises
raise the question.
It does raise the question. So what are we doing now on the AI alignment front that is so bad?
So the way we think about alignment right now is, or at least the way that our labs are implementing the solutions for alignment, is based on the idea that we can identify what we want our models, our agents to do. We can identify the values that we want or the preferred behaviors. And that's just data. We just need to collect data about what it is we want models to do. Mm-hmm. And then basically get that into the model, get that into the training data. I can talk about the particular techniques we use for that right now. So that's the way we think about it now. I sometimes will say it approaches values, norms as just features of the environment, like rocks in the environment or obstacles for self-driving cars or whatever. And you just need to get that data in there about values, norms, and so on. I think that's the wrong way to think about values and norms.
So I take it what you're thinking of here are things like, I know that Anthropic engages in what they call constitutional learning, or they use a constitution in order to train the thing. So that's a long document that says something like, you should value humanity, respect people, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. And it's a very long document that they recently updated. That's one way of getting it in, right? And then another way is people responding to what the AI says and says, no, don't say that. That's not commensurate with our values or something along those lines. So that's reinforcement.
Yeah. So those two approaches you've identified. So I'd say the first one to think about is actually to start with reinforcement learning from human feedback. That's the thing that created the big ChatGPT moment. That was coming out of a paper at OpenAI. Actually, I was on contract with OpenAI at the time and was following this process, talking with the team about how to approach this. And it was actually thought of as, how do we get models to follow instructions? But it was basically take a prompt or a question and first of all, get humans to demonstrate what's the right way to answer that question. Explain the moon landing to a 5-year-old. Sure. Right. What's a good way? So that's normative, right? This is a better answer than that one. And then you take that data and so you train the model to get better at matching what humans do. So that's with supervised learning. And then you say, okay, now let's take that and produce outputs from the model and then have humans again rate which is a better or a worse answer. And that includes asking the labelers, who are those humans who are saying what's better and worse, to say, take into account we don't want answers to be racist, or take into account that we don't want them to give advice. We don't want the model to give advice on how to build a bomb. And then there's the reinforcement learning piece of this that says, okay, now train the model to be good at predicting which answers would get a good score from humans. So that's reinforcement learning from human feedback. What Anthropic did in the first round is, when they introduced constitutional AI, they said, okay, we think we can do this without so much human input. We could let's take the documents that humans, like the UN
Declaration of
treaties,
Human Rights,
or terms of service from the Apple contracts, or things that our researchers have written. Those are written representations of rules and principles. And now let's just train the model to predict eventually what's a good interpretation of how you'd apply those rules to choosing between this output and that output.
Yeah.
Now, the original version of that didn't look so different from the instructions you gave to humans with reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF.
hmm
The more recent version, but they called it constitutional AI at that point. The
Yeah.
more recent version of constitutional AI that you're referring to, the 80-page or something document that's
Yeah.
now on their website as Claude's Constitution, is a much more discursive, here's a long discussion written mostly led by a philosopher. Say, what are good values? What is it that we hope for the way you will see the world, Claude?
And the rationale, I think, for valuing
Right,
those things, right? Or why
right,
this is to be preferred over that.
right. Part of the rationale that they gave for making this move was saying what we found was that when you gave these sharp instructions, like don't be racist,
Yeah.
that there were gaps, there were problems, there was gaming the system. Like, oh, I can figure out how to comply with that rule without
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
complying with the underlying values. So that was the move too. Now, the Constitution you started off with there.
So it's an attempt to give the Constitution its own case law.
Well, there's actually other people who are thinking about actually developing case law because
Yeah.
they're not actually, there's discussion of different cases, but it's not actually, here's a series of, that's an interesting thing to think about doing, right? Because that is way we develop our legal reasoning.
Right. Ethical reasoning is often based on comparing
Yep.
with existing cases. Look, we think this is ethical in this case, but that's the place that we're starting from. Here's
Yes.
this novel case. Let's compare it against our ethical judgments in the established
Right.
case. Is this new case sufficiently similar such that we should come
Right.
to the same conclusion? Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So
Right,
both
right.
legal
Take
and
those
ethical cases, we do that.
Take those cases where we feel like our intuitions are strong.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
then say, okay. And then when we look at, oh, why do we feel so differently about that case from this case? Can we unpack that into identifying what the factors are, the considerations that change our judgment?
All right. So look, this all seems eminently reasonable. Seems like a decent way of going about doing things. You actually helped them do this. So at some point you seem to have thought, I think this is a reasonable way of going about things. But you now think, no, it's not. Do I have the right? It's not the right way of going about things. That this is, it's either, do you think it's not optimal? There's better ways of doing it? Or is this actually not merely suboptimal, but also somehow dangerous or counterproductive or self-undermining or such? How strong is the criticism and what is it?
Yeah, I think it probably goes to the extent of saying, I think this could be more dangerous. But I think for me, I'll often say, for me, the existential risk that I worry about with powerful systems is that we just break the way the world works. We just break all our human systems, economic, political, moral, whatever.
Seems bad.
It sounds bad, right? We don't need rogue AI to have a bad outcome there. And the reason is because, as reasonable as it sounds to say, let's find what are the rules that humans want us to follow, and let's just train the model on those rules, or what are the values, what are the principles, which is what the current methods do. Well, that's not a great theoretical story about how normativity works, which is to say, we don't come into the world and say, oh, there's an existing set of rules that we all need to figure out how to follow. Rather, we participate in very complex, dynamic ways in constructing what I would say is what I would call our normative social order. The dangers are that actually humans don't just carry around a list of rules and then go from place to place and try to follow those rules. They're actually responding to, what are the rules here? What are the rules today? What are the rules in this particular group? Which is a much more dynamic process. And we have the generalizable capacity, which is what I call normative competence, to go into really any normative setting and figure out, by looking at the behaviors of people, what are people punishing, what are they sanctioning, what are people critical of, what are institutions doing, what are the sources that people here are looking to figure out what's the right way to behave. So we actually have that much more flexible, generalizable capacity. So I think humans don't just carry around a set of rules. Like when we educate our kids, right? We raise our kids to be normatively competent. We don't just
Yeah.
stuff them with a list of rules.
Yeah. Okay. So lots of things, lots of questions, lots of things to say. So one thing is that maybe this is relatively minor, but even that. So first of all, defining terms, I take it by something like normative social worldview. You mean something like roughly how you think things ought to go, or
Actually,
how
I
you
mean,
think how you think people ought to be, or what they ought to do.
yeah, let me just define a few of my terms because
Yeah.
normativity, people use it in lots of different ways. So by
Mm,
normativity, I'm a social scientist. I'm doing predictive theory of
mm,
how normativity works as a way of interaction for humans. And normativity I use to mean just the practice we have of classifying behaviors as this is an okay thing to do, this is not an okay thing to do. And I actually think you can use just that binary classification to talk about almost anything we do. And it's very dense. Almost everything we do has some classification. It's okay to do it that way, not okay to do it this way. So that's
hmm.
normativity to me. And normative social order is what we achieve when a group of people, and I'm going to talk about people for now, a group of people are basically they've established an equilibrium, a stable state, where there's a shared classification. These are the okay things to do, these are the not okay things to do. And through the behaviors in the group, mostly the enforcement behaviors, like the
Yeah.
sanctioning behaviors, they've got everybody basically following that pattern, right? So
Okay.
that the normative social order. So I'm actually trying not to come at this as a normative theorist
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
sense of what should the world look like. I'm trying to analyze how does the structure work by which humans establish a normative social order, and every human group establishes some normative social order or it doesn't persist as a group.
Okay. So it's an empirical issue about how people come to have the views about what ought to be, something like that. A normative social view is a set of views about how the world ought to be, how people ought to act, etc. But your work is not in prescribing what normative social views they ought to embrace, because they
Yes.
conflict, obviously, right? You can have the views that women are inferior. That can be part of a social normative view, and women are equal is not part of a different social normative view. And so you're in the business, at least in part, of describing what those normative social views are and how they come to be, which is an empirical inquiry, not a normative inquiry.
So I would say it's empirical, yes, but it's predictive, it's theoretical. I am working with a theory that says a stable normative social order will probably have these kinds of characteristics, or these are the capacities
Yeah.
that agents would have in order to maintain or participate in stable normative social order. So I'm trying to be, and this was actually the original motivation for developing this work, which goes back actually about 16, 17 years that I've been thinking about this, and work I originally did with Barry Weingast, political scientist at Stanford, was to say we've got all these discussions around, and we were thinking in particular about legal order, but no really good theory of what constitutes legal order. How do you help countries that don't have a lot of legal order
Yeah.
develop legal order? So it was trying to be a social scientist, a predictive, positive theory social scientist to understand the dynamics of normative systems. So not
Yeah.
starting from a normative premise, what would be good, except to say groups need to maintain their stability.
Okay. That's all super helpful. So if I think about what's going on more generally, it sounds like the developers, let's say at Anthropic or OpenAI, et cetera, they think, look, let's train this thing up in a certain way. And your critique is something like, yeah, but look, what you're training it to do is to acquire a social normative view. You want it to have whatever that social normative view is. You live in Silicon Valley or you're in the West broadly, so probably it's going to be a social normative view that they're not going to be down with in Saudi Arabia or something like that. But that's broadly, and your critique is something like, But look, that's not how people acquire social normative views. You're doing it the wrong way. We don't acquire it by having these hard and fast, non-context sensitive rules. We do it by embedding ourselves in various contexts and learning what's appropriate in a given context, something along those lines. So one question, though, is, suppose it is back on behalf of the data scientists. Yeah, fine. Okay, that's how humans do it. That's how humans acquire a social normative view. Does it need to be the only way that one acquires a social normative view? You could, to get thought experiment here, you could imagine a god with a social normative view, even though they weren't raised in a certain environment, blah, 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 blah. And maybe you can imagine an AI that acquires a certain social normative view without going through the same kind of process that humans do. So I guess the question is, broadly speaking, two questions. One, are we in the right in the first place in trying to give the AI a social normative view? Is that sort of broadly speaking the right goal? Or instead, do you think, don't even try to give it a social normative view, that's not on the table? Or is it that, or give it a social normative view, but the way you're going about it is wrong, and they say, we're just not going about it the way that humans get one. We're doing it a different way. What's wrong with that?
Yeah. I don't think of this as giving the model a social normative view. That is to say, I'm not saying that's the goal. But I do think that's the way we're currently thinking about it in the way we're doing our RLHF or constitutional AI. We are
Alignment
actually
more generally, yeah.
Exactly. We're saying what are the rules, what are the principles, what are the values? The Claude Constitution, it actually concludes with a sentence that says, we hope we've laid out here a self that Claude sees as worthy of being. That really is squarely in the framework of we're trying to develop a good agent, a good entity, right?
Yeah, it's rationalist conception of how you get there.
It says you could do it through the communication, through text of values and principles, but it also has this idea that that's what we're building. We're building an entity that has an embedded set of values. And obviously we want models that value the things that we value. But the challenge that I see with the way we're approaching and the reason that humans do this differently, I think, and that's why we should do it differently with AI, is number one, it's brittle. Because, and this is something that I've done a lot of work on, something you can call the incompleteness problem. No matter what your specification is of what you think is the right behavior, it's going to be incomplete. And in fact, that's my theory of why we get the evolution of legal institutions, or what I would call classification institutions, is there's constant ambiguity.
Yeah, constant new case law.
Constant new case law, constant reasons to say, we got to go talk to the elders. We need them to resolve. Is this appropriate here or not? And I just published a study actually looking at this with the elders, how the elders as an institution operates among the Turkana of Kenya, to say, can we see features of that process that are resolving that ambiguity in a way that coordinates this community so that they maintain a normative social order and they all remain coordinated on a shared classification. We may disagree before the elders have spoken, but we present our case, we talk about it, and they say, this was okay, this was not okay, and now we all move forward. So number one, it's brittle to think that we can just write out what the rules are. Say, no, they actually can't. You need something that's adaptive. And then, of course, there's a major legitimacy problem, which is to say, okay, can our AR developers be the ones to say, here are the values, here are the rules?
Sure.
The literature on alignment, for example, is struggling with the recognition that, people have differences of opinion about what's appropriate behavior.
You would have thought that would be obvious, but
it is. I'm in a lot of conversations where people say to me, yeah, but there's universal values, right? There's things that everybody would agree. And I say, you give me anything you think is on that list, and I guarantee you I can find a community of people somewhere in history, some point on the planet, somewhere on the planet that said, actually, that was okay. Right? There's
easy.
There's actually, it's not hard. And it's
the
not
example
hard.
that I like to give is if you look at the original organizing charter of the KKK, they go on and on about fairness. So they're at a high level. You want to say they're universal values. Everyone is for fairness. No one wants unfair situation. Yes, everyone signs on to that. But they have very different conceptions of what
Yeah.
that looks like on the ground. So
And
KKK
that's
has
why
their
they need
version, and yeah,
exactly. And that's why they need institutions. Like I sometimes say about constitutional AI, I say, look, the thing about constitutions, there's no such thing as a constitution separate and independent of a constitutional court, constitutional doctrine, just the norms of what is
yeah, yeah,
appropriate and inappropriate, approaches to interpreting. And we have all this structure around how we resolve that. We write things down like equal protection under the law or due process in a
yeah.
constitution, but it's pointless if you don't have a process for resolving specific cases and ambiguity.
Okay, so I've got at least 3 questions bopping around in my head. It's like a pinball machine in there. One question has to do with if we need to talk about rules at all, or if rules is the right thing. So one way you put it earlier is what we learn is that the rules vary by context. And it's not obvious to me that we have to see something like the adoption of, in your language, a normative social role as a matter of seeing rules from case to case. One thing that you might think is something like you see some things are relevant and some things are not. Some things are important, some things are not. There's not rules for what specifies what's important. It's more like you have a sense of the situation. If I took a kind of analogy or something like that, when a surgeon goes into the ER or something along those lines, and she doesn't say, okay, step 1, step 2. Usually things are haywire, right? There's all sorts of variables. And what makes her a good surgeon is not that she's learned the new rules in that situation, but she's got a sense of this is what's important right now. Then I've got to do this. And then this thing, oh, this thing popped up. So it's highly adaptive, but it's not highly adaptive to the rules changing. Rather, it's something like being highly adaptive to what's salient or relevant or most important to address right now. And a sense of why that is the case, although the sense of why that is the case may be more implicit based on experience that she might not readily articulate in a classroom or something along those lines. So one thing is just pushing back on the rule stuff.
Mm-hmm.
A second thing, and I'm just saying this so that I don't forget it partially, what was interesting about the end of the Anthropos Constitution that you said is, we hope that you find this something like persuasive, blah, blah, blah. And this raises the distinction between knowledge and motivation. So it's one thing for you to have a social normative view, something like, this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do, this is good, this is bad, this is above and beyond the call of duty. It's not even in your binary permissible, impermissible. It's good and above and beyond the call of duty. So it's not impermissible not to do it, but it's good to do it. This is good to do sometimes and all the times. Anyway, you could know all those things and just not care. You might find yourself motivationally cold by the whole thing. This is sociopaths, right? Sociopaths are good at articulating a social normative view in which they're technically embedded, but you might want to say they don't sign up for it. Maybe there's a lack of judgment of approval. Maybe there's a lack of motivation, desire, something we can diagnose the sociopath in all sorts of ways. But it seems to me like it's one thing to teach an AI the social normative view, and another thing to think that, or to give it, if you like, the motivation, very broadly construed, to actually abide by or live within that social normative view. The last thing I want to say, and I still want to talk about the institution, so that's really the fourth thing. But actually, you know what? I'll stop there. There's too much stuff. I'll stop there.
Okay. They're great directions to go. So let's do the rules bit first. So I don't use the language of rules. I put it in my book title because you have to say something that's going to be
Yeah, I get it.
People are going to, and my editor said, you can't say law.
Not a place for subtlety.
Yeah, exactly. But actually, it's one of the key descriptors that we dropped in the theory, precisely because it's partly, that's what we're trying to explain, is the structure of how we achieve this normative social order. So the only concepts that I use in the theory is classification. Okay, not okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an enforcement mechanism of some kind. And basically, enforcement mechanisms for humans throughout our history have been third party, basically bystander enforcement, right? And this goes to the motivation point. The biggest enforcer we have had throughout most of our history, and we still use in very different ways now, is we kick you out of the group. Right? There's benefits to humans from being in a group because we have trade, we have specialization, the division of labor, we have sharing, we have shared care, we have shared insurance, all those things. And for most of our history, if you couldn't stay connected to the group, you're basically dead,
Sure.
right? So we have classification, shared classification. We all agree, we don't necessarily agree. We've all settled on this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. And we've incentivized and coordinated people to, oh, wait a second, somebody just did something that is classified in our community as unacceptable.
Yeah.
They ate the wrong kind of food, right? They said the word
Yeah.
we won't say. A woman did that and she's not allowed to do that. A man did that, he's not supposed to
Sure.
do that. And we've coordinated people to say, to just be critical, to make fun of people, and then
Yeah.
working our way up. And if you keep doing that, we're kicking you out. You made your bows in the wrong way. We're going to kick you out of the group. There's evidence on that one. So I don't even think it's about rules because
A way of life by which you can figure out what gets classified where.
yes, and
Even if there are no
being
hard
able-
and fast rules that the way of life articulates for how to
Right.
classify.
So I think this is the fundamental thing we are doing as we move as humans from setting to setting is we're making predictions. What would be the reaction from
Yeah.
this group to that behavior?
Yeah.
And we can think about how adaptable we are. COVID is a great example of our normative social order actually had to adapt to all these things. Do you wear a mask? Do you not wear a mask? Do you get vaccines? Do
Yeah.
you stand 6 feet apart? Right? We actually all adapted to that. And a lot of that was this predictive problem that we were all engaged in. How will the group respond if I wear a mask, don't wear a mask, et cetera? And you can't really talk about it as rules for exactly the reason you identify is people's idea of a rule is you can write it down, it can be compact, and it can be exhaustive, right? And say, no, they're never like that. And that's why, in fact, so many of our rules that we're thinking about are written in pretty vague language. I taught
Yeah.
contract law for 35 years. Good faith, reasonable
Right.
efforts, best
Yeah,
efforts,
yeah, yeah.
right?
Sure.
Never mind constitutional
Tons of room
law,
for
just
interpretation, yeah.
ordinary commercial interaction.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I say, look, this is exactly the lesson of machine learning, too, right? Good old fashioned AI. The belief was that we could build artificially intelligent systems by giving the system rules of behavior. Just break down
Right.
what it is to interpret an image to a set of rules about circles and lines and
Right,
so
right,
on,
right.
or to drive a vehicle or whatever. You can't do that. What did we learn? Feed the machine tons of data and it will discover the patterns and it'll actually have it turns out with lots and lots of data, it gets very flexible and all of a sudden, boom, it
Right.
can identify cats. So I think there's something similar here. It's okay, now we got to go to the next level. Why do you think that you're going to be able to just specify the rules
Yeah,
for
yeah.
behavior? In fact, what we're doing in this is this complex predictive thing heavily dependent on, wait a second, I walked in and I wasn't wearing a mask and people started raising their eyebrows. Or even I was just on an airplane a month ago and
Yeah.
my husband and I both put on masks I can't remember now what motivated us to want to wear masks again.
Yeah.
But I was perfectly aware that I might be walking past people down the aisle who were looking at me and either thinking, what an idiot, or,
Sure.
oh my God, don't do that to us again. Take that thing off.
Yeah. I
Right?
may
I
have been
mean-
one of those people. Yeah.
And being competent, normatively competent, is being able to do that.
So there's two, I think. Okay. One is, I think it's a definition question that leads to a substantive question, which is, so is having a certain motivational profile part of holding, in your language, a social normative view, or does that
Okay,
come?
but I just want to just look, because I don't say
Yeah.
normative social view. I talk about normative social order,
Mm,
classification, enforcement, normative
Okay.
competence. But I actually don't have view in there. Worldview is not part of my framework.
okay. So there's a way that a person is such that they classify things as okay or not okay.
Yes.
And if I misclassify or act contrary to the classification, here's my sanction or here's my praise if I go the right way.
Yes.
That's what I mean by social normative worldview. That's what.
Yeah, so I would say that's predictions about the shared classification, because I may have my idiosyncratic classifications,
Mm.
but the ones that will allow me to predict how will the community respond to me
Okay, I see.
are the shared classifications.
So then it feels like we're not actually talking about the ethical or the normative views of people. We're just talking about the non-normative beliefs that people have about the communities normative beliefs.
Yes, but let's dig into that a little bit. And it goes also to your knowledge and motivation point. And now we could talk about Adam Smith. And I do talk about Adam
Sure.
Smith, but the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith,
Sure, yeah.
and the impartial spectator.
Yep.
So what does Smith say it is to be a moral person? It is as if you carry around an impartial spectator internally. And you want that impartial spectator is a fair and informed and fair judge of your conduct. And in a sense,
Yeah.
you kind of run your behaviors past the impartial spectator.
Sure, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
you're both trying to choose your behaviors so that they would be approved in that way, or if you're reflecting on what you did already and you're saying, oh, and it's not a pure empirical prediction about what would
Sure.
people who actually saw me do this, or people who, whatever views they have. That's a pure empirical. So
Sure.
Smith is really clear that it's the fair and impartial judge. You could then actually say, so people carry around their complex way of thinking, and they've learned this or whatever, they've absorbed it from their community. Moral reasoning, our systems of moral reasoning, I would say, is an example of a classification institution.
Right. Sorry. So yeah, for Smith, if I recall correctly, for it to be an ethical judgment is for it to be a judgment made from that impartial third part standpoint, et cetera. But I thought you were saying that your own personal views about what's good and bad and right and wrong can come apart from the communities. So you'll predict that they're going to say this is the right thing to do or this is the wrong thing to do, but that might be separate from your own distinct ethical judgment. So
I think
the community thinks that being gay is wrong, but I myself personally don't subscribe to that. So when I say being gay is permissible or is ethically permissible, I'm not predicting how my community is going to classify the act. I'm just saying my own view. So there's a difference between predicting how the community will assess and my own assessment.
No, but I also think that's a modern thing, right? I think this is like having these things come apart. I think that is modern, but historians or philosophers might disagree with me.
Yeah, I think there's always cases in which people engage. Think about Socrates saying, what's pious? That's him saying, I know that you think it's pious to turn in your father or whatever it is, but is it really? Let's think about what it is to be pious. I think you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. So
that might be still, maybe I'm using modern. Historians would not be happy with it. Because I kind of go back to hunter-gatherer and say, the vast part of our, but we don't know. We don't know. So maybe that's not the right way to explore this. I think the point is, the key thing I'd want to emphasize is actually our classification institutions, and by institution, I just mean a structured way of reaching these determinations of this is okay and this is not okay, are highly complex. And so I think of our systems of moral reasoning actually are ways in which we are making predictions about what kinds of claims be accepted. Like, what would be the response? I haven't done as much thinking about the way in which these come apart, but it's an interesting point because the things that classification has to do is, on the one hand, to be relatively stable so that we can predict how the group is going to respond, and we can make we can live our lives.
Something is right the one day and wrong the next day, and it changes every day. You got
exactly.
chaos.
And that's a basic concept of rule of law, right? Like, it just can't keep changing every morning when you wake up.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the whole purpose of this structure is to allow us to adapt to unforeseen, new, evolving circumstances. It's the problem of ambiguity. So we need to balance that stability with capacity for adaptation. So one of the ways to think about the individual views coming apart from the social is we also have processes for how we get that. Wait a second, I want to put up my hand and say, look, your reasons for why this community says being gay is not acceptable and you have laws against same-sex relationships, that's wrong. Let me now present you with my reasons. So like we could go to Rawls and public reason, right? Now, but that's because we have these structures that both say we're not going to get killed for our views. In some places, at some times, people would have been for articulating those. So they would have to be very private. But then we also have this structured way in which we say, let's develop that. And let me put forward for you why your concept of fairness should accommodate to seeing why this is unfair to be critical of my status as a gay
Yeah.
person or engaging in a same-sex relationship.
So there are two things we're talking back and forth between, at least in my head. And when we're talking about what it is, we're talking about raising a moral creature, raising an ethical creature, something along those lines. Because we're trying to, quote unquote, raise AI to be an ethical creature. So there's one view, which we critiqued early on, or something like you give it a bunch of rules that are context insensitive, and then it just takes those context insensitive rules and applies them to the context, and off it goes. And that just seems like a disaster. Totally on board. There's two other things, though, that we've talked about now. And I think you're... Okay, whatever. There's two other kinds of things that you've talked about. So three things, really, and I want to get clear on them. One thing is, it's not about the rules. It's about being sensitive to the reasons given the context. And that's still, if you like, in the rationalist camp. It's in the head, so to speak. It's a matter of the intellect. It's seeing this is the right thing to do. Here's why it's the right thing. Here's why your conception of fairness, what would count as fair in this circumstance, is the wrong judgment to come to. Here's my argument for why. So it's the stuff of standard academic applied philosophy, applied ethics. That's one camp. Or that's one way you might think, here's how you raise a being. And that's probably not how we typically raise beings. Maybe it is. We just do a really bad job of it. The other kind of thing feels a little bit more, I don't know, I want to kind of say social emotional, something along those lines, where I'm thinking about you're raised by parents. Broadly speaking, I suppose you could say we're raised by a community. And we somehow or other come to get a sense for what kinds of things they're going to classify how in a given context. And it's not really explicit rules. Maybe they're implicit rules. Maybe they're not rules at all. Maybe it's something else. But there's a kind of a molding of both the mind and the character, so to speak, which is different from just engaging in ethical inquiry, an ethical deliberation of the sort of academic variety. And so one question is, how much do you see as the right way to align AI is context-sensitive reasons, it's a matter of the mind, blah, blah, blah. Second question, how much do you see it as a matter of some kind of social emotional upbringing that we have that molds our characters more broadly, not just our minds? And then the third thing that you've talked a bunch about, but I haven't really asked you about yet, and I want to understand it more, is the role that institutions play in all of this. Because when I think about being raised by my parents, or my parents and my extended family, or my friends and family, etc., I don't think about the role of institutions. I'm not even sure what institutions we're talking about. So big question, across those three things, how are you thinking about what proper, good, plausible AI alignment looks like?
Yeah. Actually, so you articulated two visions of raising that you described as an ethical being, one with rules or social emotional, but I actually want to propose it's a third. And I think it's about building normative competence, which is the generalizable capacity to really go into any setting and say, wait a second, can I figure out what are the rules around here? What's acceptable behavior? How would people I learn how to predict in this setting. So rather than, if we think we certainly, when we raise our children, we absolutely do say, we're going to say, don't hit the other kid in daycare, right?
Sure.
Or we're absolutely conveying our set of rules and our values. And I think you could think about that. It's not the rational process. It really is that what you described as a social, emotional. You get lots of feedback from your parents and teachers and peers and so on about what's appropriate. But my claim is actually one about what is it that the child is acquiring there? I think the child is acquiring the generalizable cognitive capacity to recognize that, wait a second, the world is organized into things that are okay and not okay. And that actually can vary a lot, right? Like when I'm at home, this is it. When I'm at school, it's this. When I'm hanging out with my friends, this is it. And it's that general capacity. So I always say, look, I could take anybody and plop you down in any community, any place on the planet, any point in history, and you are normatively competent. You've gotten this far in life, right? You're normatively competent. You could figure it out, even if it was very different from what you were raised with. And you would have maybe those ways in which your own values were coming apart, but you've been raised in an egalitarian society and now you're plopped down into a very stratified society, right? You would still figure out who it was okay to talk to and who it was okay to
Yeah.
shake hands with and so on. You would, and it's that general, so I call that normative competence. And I actually think that it's part of the message here is to say human normativity and human normative systems are incredibly complex, and they are constituted by very complex systems of interaction and behavior and perception and reasoning. And it's why I don't, for example, think that we can just say, provide this kind of reasoning. Like when you're saying the capacity to rationally deduce.
Yeah.
Here's a general principle. It's possible to rationally deduce, therefore, all the classifications that would flow in specific circumstances from that general principle. I don't think it's a good story about the way societies work.
Suppose I said what you're describing as a normative capacity to predict what will get classified where.
Yeah.
Is it really maybe you want to call it normative? I wouldn't call it ethical. I'd call it something like prudential. It's prudence. That's what it sounds like to me, because it sounds like I plop you in a space and you're going to learn what you're going to get slapped for and what you're not going to get slapped for. And you need a generalized capacity to sense what am I going to get slapped for and what am I not. That feels to me more like prudence, like looking out for yourself, than it does anything like a view about what's morally or ethically right or wrong or good or bad. The capacity to recognize what's good or bad or right or wrong would be different from just predicting what I'm going to get slapped for. It has something to do with people's pain matters. I'm causing this person pain, so it's the wrong thing to do. I'm doing it just for fun. That's no good. I might also get punished for it. And that's another reason not to do it, this prudential reason. But the ethical reason has to do with I'm causing unneeded suffering or something along those lines. And so then if we take that distinction between prudential reasoning and ethical reasoning, and then we applying it to the AI alignment case, I would think that AI alignment is about the ethical stuff, not trying to get the AI to watch out for itself so it doesn't get slapped.
Yeah. I'm putting forward an instrumental account of the development of ethics, the development of ethical reasoning. And that's also why I think it's really important to think about this in evolutionary terms, and therefore to be thinking about human societies from the beginning of human societies. I'm trying to develop theory that's predictive. So this is where I'm an economist. And I'm saying, okay, I want the most parsimonious model I can build. I want to explain the phenomenon of ethics, ethical worldviews, right? All of the complex, rich story that you're telling about the way we think about how to behave. Okay, I want a theory that'll help me predict that. So here's what makes me an economist. I say, okay, I can't assume anything at the start of my theory that just says, oh, let's assume people are ethical. People have ethical worldviews.
Sure.
Where did those come from, right? Other animals don't. Like, where did that come from? How did we build it? Why does it have this shape and not that shape? So I'm using economics as a predictive model. So so the only thing going on with my agents in my economic model that's developing here is, and you can think about, is you need to pursue your well-being. And by the way, the number one thing you need to do to pursue your well-being is not get kicked out of the group, right? Now, I absolutely think that we have developed, as I say, enormously complex and rich. And in fact, we have a way of talking as we are talking now about thinking about what's the right thing to do. Now, of course, when you are thinking about here's how I think about the ethics of this choice. You're not doing that the way you would if you lived on a planet on your own, right? You are tapping into and drawing on a rich set of traditions, and I would say what I would call meta norms about how that kind of reasoning works. And you also live in a community where you say, I know that there are other people who will be thinking about this in those ways. So it's not just that empirical prediction of punishment, but it says, look, there's a prudential component here, or what I'm just calling the instrumental one of all the structure that we've developed. I think we can get some predictive traction on that. We can get some analytical traction on that. by saying, how does this relate to staying a member of the group?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Can I tell you about one of my favorite books right now?
Please do.
It's Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber's The Enigma of
Okay.
Reason. And they're cognitive scientists. And they have an account of the evolution of reasoning
Hmm.
among humans. And the reason I love it is because it's a fundamentally social account of reasoning. It's not reasoning emerged so you could get better answers to causal questions sitting on your own in a room. It was reasoning emerges because we live in groups, and when we take actions, we need to provide justification for what those actions are. And then we need to be good, develop the capacity to critique those justifications. Now they're thinking about the actual development of cognition,
Yeah.
and they're part of the world of cognitive science that thinks of this in modular terms, but I don't think you have to think of it in modular
Hmm.
terms. But the idea
Yeah.
that there are cognitive processes that are dedicated to producing justifications, critiquing justifications, furthering
Yeah.
so that we can engage in the kind of reasoning that Smith is talking about.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
how would this reasoning work? I think this is so much more complex than
Yeah.
the idea that we just have a set of rules or we have a set of values. We just need to communicate that to the model.
Yeah. So 2 last questions. One I'll just maybe it's just a note. You can give all sorts of explanations, and this is about the book, not your work in particular, but just responding to that. You give all sorts of explanations for how we got to have certain kinds of capacities, psychological, mental capacities, without that exhausting what those capacities are for, right? So it might be that I tell a certain story about how I developed or how humanity developed a mathematical capacity. And maybe I say we even did it so that we could count beans and trade them or whatever. We can engage in bartering or whatever. But that would mean that it's not for doing theoretical physics or something along those lines. It would just say, we got this capacity to do math, and we can maybe there's a sort of evolutionary story about how I'm sure there are evolutionary stories. Some of them are true about how we developed a mathematical capacity. But that would do nothing to settle the debate about what's the capacity good for, or when should we use it, when is it operating well, et cetera. So you wouldn't say something like, oh, your capacity is not operating well because you're not bartering anymore. You'd say, no,
Right.
that doesn't mean that capacity is broken. It just means that the capacity and what I do with it now is divorced from the causal origin of it. And that's just a note. But I'll still read that book. It sounds good. It sounds interesting. The other thing this is the last question, and it's again about how you think about these things and how it applies to AI alignment. So when you're engaging in that predictive work, you want to be this sort of economist who predicts what are people going to approve of, what are they going to disapprove of, so on and so forth. Your models are meant for, I don't know, models, maybe I'm using model literally, maybe it's metaphorically, whatever. But your model for making those predictions is informed by the peculiar constitutions of human beings, right? With their evolutionary background, with their DNA, what it is, with their social upbringing, blah, 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 blah. So you're predicting a certain kind of beast, right? You're not making predictions about rats or mice. You're making certain kinds of predictions about the human animal. And so then I wonder, do the same kinds of models that you use to predict what humans are going to be like, does it apply in the case of, if you like, the digital beasts of AI?
So now we're using model. I'm using model in multiple ways, right? I'm talking, the one hand, it's about as an economic model, what we say, here's an agent. An agent actually just is a utility function with certain actions that are available and information that's available, right?
Yeah.
And that's cost functions, right? That's what an agent is in an economic model. And then we say, okay, if we're going to solve that model to make a prediction of what kinds of choices those agents would make. And a key part, that's this neoclassical economics, a key part of that is not unlike, say, behavioral economics. You don't build in anything that's pro-social preferences. So just like I would say, I don't want to build in an ethical worldview, I don't actually want to build in preferences for fairness or altruism, because I'm trying to explain those things. So actually, the very parsimonious economic model that I'm talking about would absolutely apply to an artificial agent, because what is an artificial agent except certainly in AI, if you think about the way computer scientists think about an agent, an artificial agent, it's an actor it's got a utility of a reward function. It's got actions it can take, and it's got information that it gets, and so on. So it actually does carry over, because you're not building in something kind of metaphysical about humans that's different. So I think in that sense, it's the predictive theory, I think, can help. Of course, AI agents are also strange beings. A lot of the mess we get ourselves into is assuming that they're going to generalize like humans generalize, or then we say they learn like we learn. They don't learn like we learn. They've got this very weird, jagged intelligence. But I think the way to bring this back and say, what's the implication for alignment, right? Because we started off with why do I think the current approaches won't work so well? I think because they don't. What would you want to do differently? Number one is, just like we say, we've developed the cognitive capacity to read a room, right?
Yeah,
and read a community and say, this is what we can do here. So I think that's one of the things you want your models to be able to do. So I call that normative competence for AI systems. That's what we're trying to work on in my lab as well. And then alignment, rather than saying what we want is alignment to human values, specific values or specific rules, you say what you want is alignment to the processes. That's all I mean by institution. The processes by which a given community determines what is acceptable or not acceptable. That can include ethical reasoning, that can include elders, that can include court cases, legislatures, community groups, school boards. What I'm also working on is how can you align AI systems to those institutions? Now think about those autonomous AI agents that are coming, right? And we're sending them out into the world, and they're trying to make decisions like, what should I do about performing on this contract or not? Or accepting this bid on behalf of my user. Do they have the competence a human would have to say, oh, I need to refer to the processes and institutions. I actually need to get information about that. I have to watch behavior and observe and extract from behavior that I'm seeing what's considered acceptable. It's just a different, the reason I like this Mercier and Sperber is because talking about the cognitive processes says humans have a way of, I think, quickly processing and reading information that's extracting, oh, this is what people are paying attention to for classification. This is how people are responding. This is how this system is changing. This is where I might predict it's going next. And so we're trying to figure out, how do you build that capacity? And maybe you have to build institutions that are legible and operate at the speed and scale of AI to perform the same function. Humans can say, I'll call a lawyer and get some advice about, is this possible or not?
All right, so coming up next is institutions for AI.
Institutions for AI. Yep, absolutely.
Gillian, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. Really fascinating stuff.
Thanks, Reed. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wassilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.